welcome to another edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name's Eric Loopold. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So today we're continuing with our series on the black-robed regiment, and we've got a few more pastors/ministers that I want to look at before we move on from here. Probably about 2 or 3 left or so. But before we continue with that, I want to just briefly pause and remind you of the conference that's taking place in Ephrata, Pennsylvania on March 14th. It's hosted by Future of Christendom. It is a theonomy symposium, the second one that they've done. They usually do it every spring or so. It's a one-day event from about 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and tickets are only $5, although if you want to purchase a box lunch, that's a few dollars more. And so the whole point of this symposium is to look at how God's law applies to certain areas of life. And this year we're looking at laws concerning the death penalty, self-defense, and warfare. And I'll be giving a talk on Deuteronomy chapter 20 and just war theory. So if you're interested, please go to futureofchristendom.org/events, and you can click on the link there, purchase tickets, and I hope to see you there. All right, so let's now move into our main topic for the day. And today we're going to look at a pastor who's probably not super well known. His name is Samuel Stanhope Smith. Samuel Stanhope Smith. Some people just know him as Stanhope Smith. Now, he was born in 1751 in Pennsylvania and graduated from the College of New Jersey, which later becomes Princeton University, in 1769, so only 18 years old. It's a common theme among these guys. They're quite smart that they're graduating from college at age 18. Stanhope Smith served as a missionary and a minister in Western Virginia, and then became founder of Hampden-Sydney College. He then served as a professor at Princeton, and then became president of Princeton in 1795, and eventually died in 1819. So here you can see that just when he's entering the ministry is the time of the American War for Independence and the Constitutional Convention. And so his sermons would have had a pretty significant impact at the time. Now, there are 2 sermons that I want to cover. You can actually find all of his sermons. It's a free download. It's just called The Sermons of Stanhope Smith in 2 volumes. So, and they each have a table of contents, and they're about 400 pages each. So if you want to read any sermons, I would encourage you to do so. The fact that Stanhope Smith had many sermons published and available today is an indication of his influence. But the 2 sermons that I want to focus on, the first one is called Religion Necessary to National Prosperity. Religion Necessary to National Prosperity. And his main passage is from Exodus chapter 20, verses 5 and 6, which says, I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that disobey me, and showing mercy to thousands of those that love me and keep my commandments. So, Reverend Smith begins his sermon looking at how when a nation engages in idolatry and abandons religion of the one true God, the result is not good. Interestingly, he speaks often of both licentiousness and effeminacy, particularly among the men. He says this, he says, quote, when we regard it as indicating a general principle in the government of divine providence over the nations of the earth, no fact is more certain or more decisively confirmed by the universal testimony of history that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is the reproach of any people. And he continues, when a nation has abandoned religion, the firmest basis of civil government is dissolved. Voluptuousness and effeminacy, avarice and prodigality, a restless ambition, dark treacheries, and a universal disregard of justice, which are the natural consequences of a general impiety, accumulate every species of misery on a wretched people, forsaken of God and lost to virtue. The precious ties of society are broken. The national imbecility invites insult and invasion from abroad. It perishes under a fatal internal weakness and hastens to sink them in irretrievable ruin. End quote. So a lot of key phrases there, but certainly Pastor Smith makes it clear the results of a loss of religion in a nation, and essentially argues that idolatry is a form of treason and an abandonment of God, and that this is why, for the people of Israel, it was punishable by death. But the principle of the matter remains that any nation that abandons God is not going to enjoy any kind of national prosperity. Pastor Smith then goes on to argue that crimes and sins accumulate over time, which results in God's judgment. He says, quote, Almighty God visits upon the guilty inhabitants their iniquities, with the iniquities of their fathers, to the third and fourth generation, and the accumulated sum of their crimes and punishments sinks them in deep and irretrievable perdition. And after introducing the topic, Pastor Smith says this. He says, quote, While they love God and keep his commandments, the blessing of heaven will be upon them. Their prosperity will be coextended with the reign of virtue and religion in the midst of them. Having brought the subject to this point, I lay down the following proposition, as resulting from the preceding illustrations, that the belief of the principles of religion and the practice of its duties under some form which is calculated profoundly to impress the public mind with the sentiment of God and the righteous government of his providence over human affairs, is essential to the prosperity of nations, whereas national impiety becomes at once the parent and the nurse of disorders and crimes which hasten their approach to destruction. End quote. So what he's saying there is his main point is that true religion certainly needs to be practiced and impressed upon the public mind. There's a public aspect to this true religion. He uses the word religion very broadly, but throughout the entire context of the sermon, and we've seen this looking at previous ministers, whenever they use the word religion, they are referring to the Christian religion. They are not referring to Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, anything like that. And so we just have to keep that in mind, that the word religion in an early American context is used to refer to the Christian faith. And so he argues that it needs to be a public faith and impressed upon the public mind. And the opposite of this will lead to destruction. He then argues, and this is an argument that's used by apologists today, that without God, there is no foundation for morality. He says, quote, Without religion, on what could the public morals rest? On the laws? The laws depend on morals for their own force. On reason? Are the abstractions and doubtful conclusions of reason able to combat with the force of the passions? End quote. Now that's an interesting statement there, because he argues that even if you have good laws, if public morality and virtue is gone, those laws are powerless. They can only function if there is an underlying virtue or morality among the people. And then he also argues on reason. So even if you sit down and logically go through the goodness of morality and its positive impact, that can't overpower the sinful desires and passions of a people. Essentially, they will do things that ultimately hurt themselves, that lead to the destruction of their own society if they're blinded by their sin. And here's what he then says about religion, and this is what I think is very helpful in understanding the term. He says this, quote, Religion has a power which no other considerations possess, by entering into the heart and rectifying its principles, and by arresting the very beginnings of vice in its desires and intentions. Where religion is respected, and virtuous moral habits are established under its influence, the seeds of justice, of civil order, and obedience to the laws are already sown in the heart. End quote. And so again, when he says religion, he is referring to genuine, true, heart-changing Christian faith. And when it enters the heart, then the seeds are sown for all the good things: order, virtue, justice, and obedience to the laws. And this is an important point regarding the getting the order correct, that even though laws can instruct and teach, the heart must be right in order for the laws to be ultimately obeyed. He says this, quote, "The efficacy of laws depends upon opinion, and impiety soon breaks down all the barriers which restrain the indulgence of vice and impairs the moral springs which give energy to the laws. Impiety is purely and absolutely selfish, and if there be no God, will not his own indulgence be to each man his chief good, the center to which he will point all his actions? If there is no moral law, no judge, no future state of being, why should we not devour the present moment which alone is ours? Why should not sensual pleasure be our only good? Why should we submit to the painful self-denials, the useless sacrifices of virtue? Why should the poor man permit the rich to enjoy unmolested all the benefits of society? Why should he not with a bold hand equalize their conditions? Why should the voluptuary abstain from the delicate honors of chastity? Or why should chastity disdainfully reject his pursuit? Why should not all, with one consent, plunge into those brutal pleasures which alone are worthy of a sensual nature, pleasures which dissolve the bands of society, effeminate and weaken the public force, and, absorbing everything in the vortex of self, abandon the care of the public interest, and fill the nation with assassinations, murders, adulteries, incest, unnatural crimes, and all the basest and most horrible vices. Such have ever been the fruits of impiety, where it has infected the mass of any people. Such has been its tendency to national prostration of manners and to national ruin." End quote. That was a long one, but extremely powerful. And you can see there just how wise Pastor Smith is in recognizing how things work. I mean, he points out that if there is no God, then each man becomes his own God and determines his own truth and pursues his own good, pure selfishness, or at least what you deem to be right and wrong. Okay? And he goes on to point out that if there's no judgment, if there is no God, then really what matters is now. This moment is what matters. Essentially, you only have this short life. Why are you sacrificing anything for virtue, for others? Why are you denying anything from yourself? Because all that matters is you right now in this life. Because after it's over, it's darkness, it's blackness, it's nothing. Okay, so why shouldn't people just pursue their pleasures? And what's really interesting, and this is 100 years before Karl Marx, mind you, but he says this, he says, why should the poor man permit the rich to enjoy unmolested all the benefits of society? Why should he not equalize their conditions? And so you see the logical conclusion that leads to Marxism, communism, from a lack of religion, a lack of true religion, and an abandonment of God. Because again, the poor man recognizes himself as poor, sees that the rich man gets to enjoy all the things of this life, but all that there is this life. There's no right or wrong, there's no virtue, there's no judgment. So why should he have it? Why should the rich man be able to enjoy those things and the poor man does not? And so, equalize everything. That would be the logical consequence. Now, Pastor Smith goes on to talk about the importance of public religion, not just privately in your mind or in your heart. And I find this interesting when he defends laws concerning the Sabbath. He says this, quote, "But what institution can be more favorable to virtue, to civility, to humanity than that of the Sabbath?" End quote. And he goes on to describe the importance of assembly on a weekly basis, hearing instruction from the Word of God, and how this affects the morals of a nation. What I always find interesting, though, is a lot of these pastors, if you've been listening to the last several episodes, I've tried to quote them and how they recognize the current state of affairs. And a lot of the time, it's very interesting that they recognize a common Christian sentiment But they also recognize a rising sinfulness and disobedience, which I find so interesting because I look back at those days and I think in my mind, wow, all those people were so much more virtuous and moral in many ways than we are. Maybe that's true in many ways, but from the perspective of these pastors, they think that there's legitimate problems going on in the American colonies at this time. So, for example, here's what Pastor Stanhope Smith says in the same sermon about public religion regarding the state of the culture. He says, quote, "The instruction of the last 10 years has been of no effect because it has been separated from religion. Children have been let loose to a most alarming state of vagrancy. Destitute of any idea of the divinity, they have grown up without any true notions of justice and injustice." End quote. And so I'm not entirely sure exactly what the context is regarding what he's seeing among the youth at the time of this sermon, but it's clearly not good. And he's concerned that education is being divorced from true religion so that the children are not growing up with any sense of morality and virtue and faith. Well, that's certainly true today. I believe that's a problem as well among our public schools and schooling in general here in the modern United States. So I guess a lot of these problems have just continued. Perhaps they've grown to a higher degree, but they remain the same problems as before. Pastor Smith then reiterates the importance of public virtue when he says this, quote, "Public virtue rears impregnable barriers against internal tyranny and foreign domination, and plants the most immovable foundations against the tempests of revolution. Blessed is the people whose God is the Lord." But when the ties of religion are once broken from the mind, all the most effectual restraints of moral principles are instantly dissolved. Public sentiment is absorbed in private interest. Public virtue is lost. Sensuality insulates every citizen. He has no country but self. All the energies of patriotism are enfeebled, and voluptuousness in its progress creates a base servility of soul, which is prepared to submit to any master who will favor its indolence and afford it the means of indulging its effeminate pleasures. End quote. So again, Pastor Smith points out what the lack of public virtue leads to: selfishness, no country but self, loss of public virtue, a baseness where we are willing to submit to any master that will indulge or allow us to indulge in sensuality and effeminate pleasures. And I find that interesting because one of the problems that we're having in our culture today is a lack of masculinity and an increase in effeminacy among the men. I do not believe that Pastor Smith is pointing out here that effeminacy is wrong. It's not wrong among women, but it's wrong among men. It's wrong when that is the expressed public state of things. An effeminacy indicating that men are not leading and men are not being biblically masculine. So that's something to keep in mind. Pastor Smith then continues to talk about the resulting lack of freedom that will come from abandoning true religion. He says this, quote, "And what is the consequence of this irreligious tendency in our manners? The public mind is agitated with the most violent and uncorrected passions. Deadly and murderous quarrels are multiplying beyond all former example. Station and virtue are indiscriminately attacked by the most atrocious slanders. Every man of sentiment and feeling will soon be driven from all public functions. Worth will seek to hide itself in profound retirement, and the state, unless heaven, in mercy, interpose to preserve us, will be tossed between alternate factions of unprincipled men, who will stop at no measures for their own aggrandizement, of audacious demagogues, who are restrained by no moral sentiments, of vile intriguers, who will stoop to any baseness to advance their mercenary and ambitious aims. Licentiousness is in danger of proceeding to atheism, and atheism of aggravating licentiousness, till a miserable people, lacerated by their own crimes, and tired with the misfortunes which they bring upon themselves, will be willing, at last, to seek a dreadful refuge in the despotism of a master." End quote. Now that is quite profound, and I think very accurate. So to summarize there, he's showing how when everything starts to break down in morality, then you'll see these things happen in the government too, because the government will be run by unprincipled men. He talks about factions, alternating factions that really only care about themselves, their own aggrandizement, um, who are not restrained in anything, right? You got intrigue going on, uh, ambition, all these things are going to plague the government. The government is going to stop essentially serving the people and will become serving itself. And then he says, when all this happens and the people become tired and injured from all of their sin and all that they've brought down upon themselves, they will be willing to submit to despotism. That's what they will be willing to do. Now, we've seen this play out in the French Revolution, in Germany. Uh, it's a common theme all throughout the world. But what's interesting, though, is at the time of this sermon, the French Revolution hasn't really happened. You haven't seen it in Germany, so there haven't been that many examples. So he's drawing this from Scripture and from his understanding of how humanity works. Although there are examples in the past, such as in the Roman Empire and the Greeks, where a breakdown in morality will lead to a greater and greater despotism. Now, despite all that negativity, Pastor Smith does end with a charge to the Christians that are listening. He says this, quote, "What then, Christians, is your duty in this respect to God and to your country as good citizens? I might recount all the sacrifices of piety which you owe to God, all the offices of justice and charity due to mankind, but to confine my view to a single object, it is the faithful discipline, the virtuous and pious education of your families. Families are the elementary parts of the Republic." He continues, "Be ours then, Christians and fellow citizens, the praise of the patriarch Abraham, whose resolution and glory it was that he would bring up his children and household after him to fear the Lord. Be ours the pious purpose of the heroic and patriotic Joshua, who says, 'As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.' Christians, on your fidelity and care depend the most precious interests of your beloved children. In every child, an immortal soul is entrusted to your charge." End quote. And so Pastor Smith ends by calling Christians to be faithful among their families. Even though things can get nasty in the public arena, government, and all those things, and those things are important. He recognizes their importance, but he also sees that the foundation for any society, especially a republic, is the strength of its families. And that's what Christian men should be focusing on before we can move on to really anything else. And so that is a brief overview of his sermon on how religion is necessary to national prosperity. Now I want to jump shortly, since we don't have that much time left, to his sermon on patriotism, which he gave in 1808, so towards the end of his life, and after the United States has already been formed as a nation. His main passage is Psalm 137, verses 5 and 6, which says this, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy." Now, Pastor Smith starts off by showing how God's law infused a love of nation into the people of Israel. You can see this throughout the Old Testament. They had a love for their fathers, a love for their law, their land, their capital city, all the institutions, all directed by God. So it was a good thing for them to love their nation. But then he points out, though, that it's not mentioned very much. Patriotism, the love of one's nation, is not mentioned very much at all in the New Testament. And his response is interesting. He says this, quote, "If it is less directly inculcated in the discourses of Christ and his apostles, it is because they were not addressing the people of any particular country who had laws and a government of their own. Besides, all the world was at that moment sunk under a violent and unrelenting despotism, and discourses of that nature would perhaps have tended only to tumult and insurrection. But our duties to our country, no less than those to our families, result from the whole spirit of that benevolence which is the fundamental principle of the gospel." End quote. So what's his point there is that the focus of the apostles in Christ was not the duties of the nation or the love of one's nation because of the context that they were in and what they were trying to accomplish. But he argues that the same is true regarding the love of family. That's not really highlighted that much also in the New Testament. But the duties to our country is no less than that to our families, okay? And the spirit of benevolence, the spirit of love, is still an outworking of the principle of the gospel. Then he goes on to define what true patriotism is. He says, quote, "True patriotism, principle of so many other virtues, is a complicated and powerful affection, which attaches us to the region in which we have received our birth, to the people with whom we have become assimilated by common ideas, common manners, and common interest, and to that form of government and system of laws which preside over our union, safety, and happiness, and serve to connect us in one great political body." He continues, quote, "The men of other nations may be no less worthy our esteem than our own countrymen, but we are best acquainted with human nature as it is exhibited in the manners and habits of the latter, and appears in them cast in the same mold with ourselves. We therefore mingle our affections more easily and cordially with theirs, and more easily enter with them into those benevolent and sympathetic feelings which most closely and agreeably connect man with man." End quote. So what's he saying there? He's saying that other nations are no less worthy of our esteem. Okay, we need to care for them and love them as our fellow human beings. But, of course, we are more familiar with and comfortable with those in which we have a lot in common. And so that tends to cause us to mingle with them and build relationships easier and closer with those in which we have a lot in common. And he's not talking about like things like skin color. He said earlier that true patriotism refers to the region. So there's a geographic region in which we've received our birth. So our, growing up, our experiences, our history, and the people to which we become assimilated by common ideas, manners, and interest, and to the same form of government. And all this connects us in one great political body. And so one could argue that this is actually no different than the definition of nationalism. And I would agree with that. I think that nationalism and patriotism originally are were synonyms. It's only recently that nationalism, particularly with the rise of fascism in the early 20th century, that nationalism took upon itself a racist component to it. But here, this level of patriotism is perfectly acceptable and perfectly biblical, and what we would expect to see in the world that God has given us. Now, how does patriotism relate to the gospel? Here's what Pastor Smith says about that. Quote, "The spirit of the gospel requires that we should be ready to comfort and assist human nature wherever it presents an object to our benevolence which needs our aid, and which we are able to relieve. But the entire mass of mankind forms a system too vast to be the direct and immediate end of our actions. This immense sphere is subdivided into many inferior circles, and when each man circumscribes his labors to promote the interest and improvement of one, the prosperity of the whole is the result of the well-directed efforts of all." End quote. And so there we see this concept of sphere sovereignty, or the idea that you can look at human experience as interlocking or interposing circles, where the people closest to you, your family, your immediate neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, those people are the people that you should direct most of your efforts to, those who are immediate and close to you. It doesn't mean that you ignore people who are from far away. Not at all. But generally speaking, people from across the world are not going to be operating in your sphere or in your circle unless very rarely, like, business trips or vacation or just things like that. And so these circles have to work their way out. And so he would argue that as the family gets better and improves, so does the community, that local community, improve. And then when those communities improve, the state or the county will improve. And then when those improve, the nation will improve. And when each nation improves, that helps and benefits the whole world. That one's pretty easy to see because, well, thankfully in the United States, we have pretty good neighbors. But if you live in other parts of the world, when the nation next to you falls apart, like in Yemen or in Syria, when those states fall to pieces, that's not good for their neighbors. Their neighbors don't enjoy that. That causes problems even for their neighbors. So we should want all nations to do well, so that everyone can benefit from that. Pastor Smith then goes on to look at how a person should love his own country and what limits to that. He says this, quote, "Let it be the study of every good citizen to promote the improvement, to seek the perfection, and to defend the rights of his country. He may be permitted to indulge a generous pride in her glory, but it should ever be with that liberal candor which is ready to acknowledge the merit of every other nation, with that rigid justice which will never lend his aid to infringe their sacred rights, with that philanthropy which never forgets that all nations are our brethren." End quote. And so then, again, I think you see there a very healthy concept of nations, nationhood, nationalism, and also known as patriotism, in which, yeah, you can have a pride in your nation and the good of your nation and the glory of your nation, but you should always be ready to acknowledge the merits of every other nation, and you are being held to the same standard of law and justice and morality, so that you will never violate the rights of other nations, and you are going to engage in that philanthropy, that generosity and love, recognizing that all nations are our brethren, fellow image bearers of God. Pastor Smith then spends time talking about the specifics of a republic and how a republic is to be formed and animated for a focus on the public well-being rather than selfishness or private well-being. He also talks about the importance of voting, the rights of suffrage, and how this must be protected and guarded as the foundation for any republic. He then highlights the importance of education for the youth. He says this, quote, "All the youth of the republic should be taught to understand that constitution of government under which they live, and to be made acquainted with the outlines of those laws which guard their property and their lives, and preside over the public peace and safety. No legislative care could contribute more to public order and to the preservation of that Constitution and those laws so necessary to the public liberty and happiness." End quote. I mean, essentially, that's pretty straightforward, that you need to teach the next generation why things are the way they are and how things work and why they are good. Or else, those children are not going to be interested or even know how to preserve what they have. What's interesting is that Pastor Smith then goes on to talk about how a republic should defend itself against threats. And he says this, he says, quote, "that the republic, while she studiously represses a spirit of conquest and love of war, should always be preserved in a complete and active condition of defense. The love of peace becomes the humanity of a republic. It is in peace, when it can be preserved with honor and with safety, that she will enjoy the greatest happiness." But then he says this, he says, "A government which adopts a feeble and timid policy and resorts to cunning rather than to open and manly counsels, and depends for her defense on the contentions and rivalships of other nations rather than on the vigor of her own genius and the energy of her own arm, will be insulted and despised." Then he addresses the American people directly. He says, quote, "Americans, if you would preserve yourselves from insult and aggression, present such a front of war on the land and on the ocean, where you equally live, as will compel the most contemptuous and unjust of your enemies to respect you." End quote. So what's he pointing out there? He's basically preempting President Theodore Roosevelt in the speak softly and carry a big stick policy. And essentially, make sure that you are strong on the land and on the sea, and don't resort to cunning, but just speak with manly counsel, be direct, and you will be respected and you'll be left alone. But you have to be able to defend yourself, not in conquest, but in self-defense. What's interesting is that Pastor Smith then ends his sermon on going back to the importance of religion. Now here's what he says. He says, quote, I have now spoken of the general obligations of virtue. Another, and certainly one of the highest duties of a good citizen, is to cultivate in his own heart and to diffuse as far as possible throughout society a spirit of pure religion and devotion. As an immortal being, religion is the most important concern of man. It is not less an object of his duty as a member of the civil state. An irreligious man is always a pernicious member of society. End quote. That's powerful stuff. And I think the argument there we can see is that actually loving the Lord and being a true Christian is more beneficial to earthly society than anything else. And in fact, being irreligious, being an atheist, being without morals, without virtues, without any basis for those things, that makes a person a pernicious member of society. So being a Christian should have a greater impact on the world you live in, not a lesser impact than the world you live in. And in defense of public religion, Stanhope Smith says this. He says, quote, "One of the first and highest duties, therefore, of a genuine friend of his country is to promote the knowledge and extend the practical influence of true religion." End quote. And again, we know true religion, he's referring to the Christian faith. Someone that loves his country is going to want to see the true religion publicly proclaimed, defended, and embraced. He ends with this call to Christians. He says, quote, "The highest service, therefore, Christians, which you can render your country is to promote by your piety and your zeal that Holy Spirit among your compatriots and fellow citizens. The republic founded on the basis of religion and virtue will be immortal. For thus says the Eternal, the fountain of truth, I will show mercy to thousands of generations of them that love me and keep my commandments." End quote. So I think Pastor Smith is completely correct on this matter, that one of the highest services that we can do is promote true religion among our fellow citizens. That's an evangelism, not just to get them into heaven, not just to save their souls, but also to turn them into virtuous people that love their neighbors and don't hate their neighbors, right? And if that is the case, if we have a republic that's founded upon God, it will endure. God will preserve it. And the principle there is God will show mercy to thousands of generations of those that love him and keep his commandments. And that was a common theme we saw throughout Israel, but even outside of Israel. We see in Proverbs 16:12, "It is an abomination to kings to do evil, for the throne is established by righteousness." And so any nation, any king that practices wickedness and it bases his reign and rule on evil and sin, that's not gonna endure. But it is generally the case, and I believe it is true, that any nation that bases itself on its love of God and obedience to his law is going to be a nation that endures, is protected, and is blessed. And certainly I think we can end on that as we reflect on the current state of affairs in our own country. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments on Pastor Stanhope Smith, please email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, message me there. You can also go to governedbygod.com and message me that way. And so thank you again. I hope you found this interesting. And until next time, take care and God bless.